Have you ever looked at a medieval castle and thought, wow, that's a fortress, completely impenetrable? Well, think again. What if I told you that many of these iconic stone giants were riddled with design flaws that seem, by today's standards, completely bizarre and even a little bit dumb? Stick around, because we're about to uncover the shocking reasons why medieval castles weren't always the perfect defenses we imagine them to be. Let's start with something you've probably seen in every movie: the grand, majestic spiral staircases. They almost always spiral clockwise as you go up, right? This was a deliberate design choice. The idea was to give the right-handed swordsman defending the castle an advantage, allowing them a wider arc to swing their swords, while attackers coming up the stairs would have their sword arm cramped against the central pillar. Genius, right? Well, not always. What about left-handed defenders? They were at a serious disadvantage on their own turf. And more importantly, what if the attackers weren't right-handed? Or what if they just rushed up in a mob? While clever in theory, this design feature wasn't the foolproof defense it's often made out to be. It was a good idea, but it assumed a very specific type of fight. Now let's talk about the windows. Or rather, the lack of them. Castles were notoriously dark and gloomy places. Windows were a structural weakness, an invitation for an enemy arrow. So, they were often just tiny slits, called arrow slits or loopholes. These were great for shooting arrows out of, but terrible for letting light and air in. Living in a castle meant living in perpetual twilight, with smoky, stuffy air from torches and fireplaces. Imagine the smell. But here's the real flaw. While these slits were great for a single archer, they offered a very limited field of view. An archer could only see a tiny slice of the battlefield. Attackers could easily find blind spots between the slits to approach the walls without being seen. So, a feature designed for defense actually created vulnerabilities. What about those classic square-shaped keeps? The big, blocky towers that we all picture when we think of a castle. They look strong, solid, and imposing. But from a military perspective, they were a nightmare. The sharp, 90-degree corners were a huge weak spot. Attackers could use tools to pry stones loose from the corners, destabilizing the entire structure. Even worse, siege engines like catapults and trebuchets could focus all their power on one of these corners, causing massive damage and potentially bringing the whole tower down. This was such a well-known problem that castle builders eventually learned from their mistakes. Later castles started featuring round or multi-sided towers, which were much better at deflecting projectiles and had no weak corners to exploit. The square keep was an early design that just didn't stand the test of time and battle. And let's not forget the water source. A castle under siege was basically a small, walled city. The most critical resource wasn't food or weapons, it was water. A reliable well inside the castle walls was absolutely essential for survival. But digging a well was incredibly difficult and expensive, especially on a rocky hilltop where most castles were built. Some castles had to rely on cisterns to collect rainwater, which could run out or become contaminated. Other castles had their main well located in the bailey, the outer courtyard, which was often the first part of the castle to fall during an attack. Once the attackers captured the well, the defenders in the keep were on a timer. Their fate was sealed. It's a shocking oversight, but sometimes the geology of the land just didn't allow for a well in the most secure part of the castle. Now for one of the most famous parts of a castle, the moat. A big ditch, often filled with water, designed to stop attackers and their siege engines from reaching the walls. It sounds like a great idea, but moats had their own set of problems. First, they were incredibly labor-intensive to dig and maintain. If the water wasn't flowing, it would become a stagnant, stinking mess, a breeding ground for disease. And contrary to movie depictions, they were rarely filled with alligators or crocodiles. They were more like giant, smelly ponds. Clever attackers could find ways to drain the moat or fill it in with earth and timber to create a causeway. And if the castle was built on porous ground like sandstone, keeping the moat filled with water was a constant, losing battle. What about the toilets? Yes, we have to talk about the toilets. They were called garderobes, and they were basically just stone chutes that emptied out directly onto the castle's outer wall. While this was a step up from a simple bucket, it created a massive, stinking pile of waste at the base of the walls. Not only was this unhygienic, creating a health hazard for everyone living in and around the castle, but it was also a security risk. During a long siege, These waste chutes could become a potential entry point for a very determined and very brave attacker willing to climb up through the filth. It's a disgusting thought, but it was a real vulnerability born from a very basic sanitation problem. Let's also consider the very location of some castles. They were often built on the highest hill for the best defensive advantage, but this also meant they were completely exposed to the elements. High winds, freezing winters, and lightning strikes were a constant threat. A lightning strike could easily start a fire in the wooden roofs and floors, and with no fire department, a fire could be just as devastating as a full-scale assault. Furthermore, being on a high hill made resupplying the castle a logistical nightmare, even in peacetime. Everything, from food to firewood to building materials, had to be hauled up steep, difficult paths. During a siege, this isolation became a fatal flaw. Another surprising flaw was the wooden hoarding. This was a wooden structure that was temporarily attached to the top of the castle walls during a siege. It jutted out from the wall, allowing defenders to drop rocks, hot sand, or boiling water on attackers below without exposing themselves. It was an effective tactic, but it had one glaring weakness. It was made of wood. Attackers could use flaming arrows to set the hoarding on fire. If the fire spread, it could engulf the entire wall walk, forcing the defenders to abandon their posts and creating a breach in the defenses. So, this temporary defensive add-on could literally backfire on the defenders. So, why did these seemingly obvious flaws exist? The main reason is that castle design was constantly evolving. It was a medieval arms race. Builders would create a new defensive feature, and attackers would spend years figuring out how to defeat it. Then, builders would respond with an even better design. The square keeps gave way to round towers. Simple arrow slits evolved into more complex cross-shaped ones for better angles. What we see as a flaw was often just a step in this long evolutionary process. They were working with the technology and knowledge they had at the time. They couldn't just look up the best castle design on the internet. They learned through trial and error, and that error often meant the destruction of the castle and everyone inside. These castles weren't perfect fortresses, but rather dynamic battlegrounds of innovation and desperation. Each so-called flaw tells a story of a lesson learned the hard way. They remind us that history is a messy, complicated process of people trying their best with what they had. The next time you see a castle, look past its romantic beauty and try to spot the weaknesses. You'll see a much more interesting and human story etched into its stones. Thanks for watching. If you found this journey into medieval engineering fascinating, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden corners of history. Let me know in the comments which castle flaw you found the most surprising. See you in the next video.